Good afternoon, friends. And as you know, we've been running a series that's called Romantic Trends in English Writing. And already we have done about 10 lectures, and more are in the offing. And today's lecture is on women's voices in Romanticism. And this is a rarer subject. I don't see many books written on this, nor women romantic poets specifically meant for study in the honors and MA courses, and yet there are women's voices. So we have for this lecture Dr. Payal Nagpal, who teaches English literature in DU's Janaki Devi Memorial College in the Department of English. She is a researcher, she is a writer, she is an analyst, and she is also a theatre person. And on Romanticism, she has something specific to share with us. So without taking much time, I would request Dr. Payal Nagpal to give the lecture. And welcome, Dr. Payal Nagpal. And since you are facing the camera after a long time, so I thought maybe you can give a connecting kind of a thing regarding Romanticism, what it is, what you mean by it, and then you come to the topic, which is women's voices in romantic writing. So please begin.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. In today's lecture, we'll be discussing the women romantic poets. And I think so far we've discussed in great detail the mainstream romantic poets, poets like William Blake as a pre-romantic, or Wordsworth, Coleridge, Lord Byron, Shelley, Keats. But the question that kept coming to my mind was that what's happening about the women in this period? How do they respond to the changing times? How is it that if there is something called the French Revolution that happens, how is it that the women respond to it? And secondly, what is their association with the process of writing itself? Do they write as a profession? Do they take it on as a profession, or do they write to pass their time? Or is it that imaginary land in which they express themselves? So I think this whole stress of the Romantic movement on the ordinary, on the common people, on nature, I think these are some standard tropes that we have. But it's really very interesting to see what the women romantic poets have to really say, and how they are not only using these tropes, but they are also part of the formation of these tropes. And I think that is an area that has been hugely neglected. And one has not really read as much, and as you rightly pointed out, that there are very few books on this particular topic. So we will be looking at about 3 or 4 important romantic poets. Now, these are women romantic poets, and they are from the early phase. So when I say the early phase, I mean women who were generally born, let's say, around 1740s or 50s, and they lived up to the 2nd or 3rd decade of the 19th century. So in this sense, this would be I think the first part of the series on the women romantic poets. So some of the questions that come to mind, A, that they are generally left out. So is there a perspective offered by the women of this period? And if there is a perspective, then what was that perspective? And what were the ways in which the women, really speaking, engaged with issues that were being taken up by the mainstream male romantic poets? Did they influence those mainstream writers in any way? I think that is also a very, very important question, because we have the trend is, in a sense, to think that it was all kind of determined, let's say, by Wordsworth or Coleridge, and developed later by the later romantic poets. But what was the role of the women romantic poets in this, and the impact of their style of poetry, in a sense, on mainstream romantic poets? So we begin with, of course, all of them are lesser known poets. Anna Letitia Barbol. And Anna Letitia Barbol was born in 1743 and lives up to 1825, which means that we are looking at a poet who belongs, in a sense, to the late 18th century and is active in the last decade or so of the 18th century and the first decades of the 19th century. And a very, very apt example, in a sense, for us to take, because here we can see how the women, in a sense, respond to their times. An interesting thing to know about Anna Barbol was that she was skilled in various languages and was famously known as Mrs. Barbol. And she, of course, believed very strongly in democratic ideas, laid great emphasis on education. She wrote political pamphlets, and of course she attacked Britain's war against France, was against the slave trade. So in a sense, we have a woman poet who participates actively in what we can call the new ideas. Interesting to know that she produced the correspondence of Samuel Richardson in 6 volumes and brought out what is called the British novelists to establish what M.H. Abrams and Jack Stillinger call a national canon in fiction, paralleling Samuel Johnson's prefaces. So, here we are talking about Romanticism as a mainstream movement, as a movement that is looked at from the perspective of the male poets. And here we have a woman poet who is skilled in various languages and is a prolific writer. An interesting poem by Barbol is The Rights of Woman, written around 1825. So she writes, and there is a twist in this poem. If you actually look at the first 2 or 3 stanzas, and it is believed that this is a response to Mary Wollstonecraft's famous text Vindication, so of the rights of woman. So she writes, yes, injured woman, rise, assert thy right. Woman, too long degraded, scorned, oppressed. O born to rule in partial laws despite, resume thy native empire over the breast. So, in a sense, she is making if one may say, the correct statement by urging the women to fight for equality. And however, if we look at the last 2 stanzas, it's very, very interesting, because there is a kind of twist here where she writes, but hope not, quoted idol of mankind, on this proud eminence secure to stay, subduing and subdued, thou soon shalt find thy coldness soften and thy pride give way. Then abandon each ambitious thought, conquest or rule thy heart shall feebly move in nature's school by her soft maxims taught, that separate rights are lost in mutual love. Now, this last line is a very, very telling line, and it can be interpreted in many, many ways. In fact, there are critics who almost, charge Barbol as being anti-feminist and say that it begins as a response to Wollstonecraft's Vindication, but takes a complete turn in the last 2 stanzas. Now, seemingly this is the case, but it's also important to understand the time period in which poets like Anna Barbol were writing. And at that point of time, feminism as we understand it as a full-fledged movement today was only something in the germs of which were there in that period, and it was something that was in formation. So that separate rights are lost in mutual love. So what she's saying is, people who've attacked Barbol say that she's talking about giving up the rights of women in love, in marriage. But I would like to differ here and say that it's more about, when she talks about mutual love, I think she's talking about equality, where there is respect and there is an attempt to treat each other at the level of equality, and so separate rights are lost in mutual love. Of course, there is another way in which this line can be interpreted, and maybe that was not the intention, but today we can also reinterpret this line to understand that love is also a kind of trap in which rights are lost. So but of course, in the time period against which this poem is to be read, I think the sense is to strive for a kind of equality. So I wouldn't kind of charge Barbol for kind of giving this twist, but I think she's kind of using the ideas that are available to her in her life and in the time period as I said, to which she belongs. Because if you look at the other poems, for example, there is a poem called To a Little Invisible Being Who is Expected to Soon Become Visible. Now over here the idea is it's about the birth of a child, and the tropes that are used, the metaphors used and the ideas used are about the nurse singing lullabies, the maternal breast, mother's eye, and so on. So there is a kind of fondness to this. So before I actually discuss another poem by Babol, which is called Washing Day, I would also request Professor Prakash to kind of share his views on a poet like this, and this particularly the poem that we just discussed being a slightly controversial poem.
Yes, I think I have something to say about this poem. But before that, may I ask you a question regarding the general, view that one can take of this particular segment of experience. That is that in the last part of the 18th century and the first part of the 19th century, this period belongs to Romanticism, and we have an active voice here in the form of this young Letitia Babol, and she in fact is senior to both Coleridge and Wordsworth. Wordsworth was born in 1770, and you tell us that she is born in 1740. So which means that she has seen more of the 18th century and quite a bit of the 19th century also, and she is more learned, she is more educated in the social ways of life. So would one say that there is a kind of element in romantic poetry that is rather male oriented when there are women and who have been witness to this kind of development?
Yes, I would totally agree there, because I think we've actually just looked at the Romanticism from one perspective. We have just not, I mean, if we actually look at this poem Washing Day that we'll discuss in some detail, I mean, she's writing a poem about the whole experience of washing clothes. Now it's something that arises totally out of the domestic scenario, and it's completely experiential. So
and she is becoming conscious about her role.
Yes,
she is to wash clothes.
Yes.
She may not be getting as much education as her male counterparts can.
Right.
They will write poetry, and she'll be confined to the washing room or to the kitchen.
Yes, but she's turning that around.
Yes.
And she's turning that around to talk about how women behave. And one of the things that we talk about when we discuss Romanticism is the whole idea of focusing on the ordinary people. Now, I think the women poets who write around this time, they are the ones who actually bring the ordinary people, the ordinary characters to the forefront. And I think any understanding...
They've borne the brunt.
Yes.
And they have labored much more than men.
Absolutely.
And she can be, a woman can be more authentic about her experience at the same time when men are writing.
And she has captured that in poetry. And in a sense, I mean, if we look at this poem Washing Day, it's written in 1797. So yes. It really and it begins with a kind of epigraph from Shakespeare's As You Like It.
It precedes this
yes.
lyrical ballads by a year.
Yes. And so I'll just read a few lines from this poem, and Washing Day is very, very interesting. So it begins with a short epigraph from As You Like It, and but I'll move on to what's there in the poem. The muses are turned gossips. They have lost the buskined step and clear, high-sounding phrase. Language of gods. Come, then, domestic muse. Now, muse is a term that we always use for something lofty. And here the muses are turned gossips. And they have lost the buskined step and clear, high-sounding phrase. The language of gods has changed. The muse is now a domestic muse. And the fact that Babol has an understanding not only of the muse, but how muse is supposed to figure in poetry, and she's conscious of the fact that she's changing that totally.
And see the irony. The irony is that so when the woman speaks, it's a gossip.
Yes.
And she herself is a gossip.
Is a gossip.
And when she is extending it to the idea of the muse.
Idea of the muse has now become a domestic muse.
Yes. And if somebody is aware of this fact, that it's a domestic kind of area that she belongs to, and she can't cross it, shows that she knows about it, and she's that way ideologically empowered.
Yes.
Unlike males.
Yes. So and she talks about the day that washing is to be done, and it's just so vividly described. Each line gives an understanding of what that day is like. So in the sense that that's a day that begins in a way that all the women who are to do the washing are very purposeful. So the breakfast is a silent matter because no time is to be wasted on these things, and everybody is just looking at the skies hoping that it doesn't rain.
Is there some humor there in this
There
point?
is a lot of humor. For instance, the man who runs the house in a sense and his command prevails is somebody who's totally sidelined on the washing day, and whatever he wants, nothing is going to be listened to. No one will pay heed to what he's saying. So within this very, very interesting domestic space, Barbauld is able to kind of, create space for women.
And that sense of ease is there,
Yes,
which
that
is not
sense of
there
ease
in
is
Wordsworth. Wordsworth is not known for his humor,
Yeah.
nor Coleridge.
Yes.
And this woman is looking around and she is critically looking at things, and then she is full of this kind of wit.
Yes, and for that reason, I think Washing Day is a really, really wonderful poem to read.
And with respect to mutual love that you mentioned as an important phrase in the previous poem, I would say that this mutuality, as you rightly pointed out, is the mutuality which is based on equal status of men and women.
Yes.
And women in the late 18th century and early 19th century would be seen as objects than subjects. So they will be desired. If somebody would approach them, would court them, would woo them, and woman would be wooed. But she is talking of mutuality there,
Yes.
which means that she is far ahead of her times.
Yes.
And as you rightly said, that in the 20th century, this thing will be realized in its full potential. She is there in the seed form, saying that there is a kind of mutuality, there is a kind of equality there, and that she can, in fact, take steps towards meeting a man and all those things.
Yes. And if we actually look at the kind of people who are described, I think we should really, it's wonderful. So there's a description of a farm, orchard, or pleasant curds and cream, or droning files or shoes lost in the mire by little whimpering boy with rueful face, because the children are also not getting any attention. So come muse and sing the dreaded washing day. So household chores are also used, in a sense to kind of describe all this. And a little later, the poem goes on like this: of sad disasters, dirt and gravel stains, hard to efface and loaded lines at once, snapshot and linen horse by dog thrown down, and all the petty miseries of life. So these are the miseries of life, and these are the miseries that belong, in a sense, to the woman's world.
True.
So she says that saints have been calm while stretched upon the rack, and a little later she says, but never yet did housewife notable greet with a smile a rainy washing day.
What I see in this description is a kind of the stuff of the novel. In the novel you mention all these small details, but she has the courage to bring in epic, like talking to the muse, which will guide her.
In fact, I must add that this is a striking aspect of all the women romantic poets. The kind of description, it's totally Balzacian. They go into this realistic description of, they don't remain in a sense obsessed with their thoughts or their musings, but they look around and they capture in poetry almost every object, every person, every character, everything that they see around them.
And they see in all these details the sense of the social life,
Yes.
which romantic poets, males do not exactly do.
Yes.
They talk about nature, they talk about magic, they talk about wonder, imagination, all those things. But women are talking about their daily surroundings, and there they see a kind of connection.
Yes.
And that is the social reality, and that has its own kind of romanticism.
Yes.
But that romanticism is mixed with sense of humor and sense of realism.
In fact, that's the best part about reading these poets, because they never lose sight of the realism of which they are a part. So, the humor is evident here when she says that, but grant the welkin fair, require not thou, who callest thyself perchance the master there. So that person is the master of the house is not required on this day. And and now towards the end of this poem, the whole idea of how the washing actually happens is described in a very beautiful manner.
How long is this poem?
It's not very long.
It would be 40-50 lines.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. So at intervals my mother's voice was heard urging dispatch. Briskly the work went on, all hands employed to wash, to rinse, to wring, or fold and starch and clap and iron and plate. Then would I sit me down and ponder much why washings were. So this is how it ends.
This is the kind of like a statement on fashions in the 18th century,
Yes.
which is the subject of manners. But then she is turning the whole thing upside down, and still talk of the muse.
Of the muse.
Yes. This is remarkable, I must say.
And of course there are other poems by Babol where she talks about nature pretty much the way Wordsworth and Coleridge talk about it later. So to actually showcase those aspects, we have another poet called Charlotte Smith.
Please, could you also tell us something about her activity, which you mentioned in the beginning, that she was participating in the social problems and missions.
Yes.
And I think that gave her the courage to talk in this tone.
Yes.
She was against the critical of the slave trade?
Critical of the slave trade, critical of Britain's war with France, the attack on France, and she believed very strongly in, of course, not only democratic ideas, but education. She believed very strongly in that, and she herself knew more than one language. Yes. So close on the heels we have Charlotte Smith, again a poet who's born in 1749 and lives up to 1806. So Charlotte Smith is very, very interesting to mark because she is known primarily for her elegiac sonnets, and Charlotte Smith separated from her husband because of his abusive behavior, and she wrote for money. Now I think this is very, very important because with Charlotte Smith we have a poet for whom writing is a profession, writing is a vocation. And here we thought that women at that time never wrote for money, and they kind of hid in some corner of their house, and they wrote for themselves, or they wrote to just preserve it in that particular notebook. But here is a poet who writes professionally, and it's important again to mark, and we must acknowledge the work done by Mitch Abrams and Jack Stillinger for compiling a lot of the works of the women poets in the Norton Anthology. So the sonnet form was devised by Charlotte Smith, and it is only after her, the sonnet form that had been discontinued post the Renaissance, it is only after her that Wordsworth and Coleridge also wrote sonnets. So she wrote sonnets before they did, and in fact Wordsworth wrote about her, and I quote, that Smith wrote with true feeling for rural nature at a time when nature was not much regarded by English poets. So here is another poet who was way ahead of her times. Not only is she using the sonnet form, but is also writing, the tone is that of an elegy. For instance, in 1784 she writes To Sleep, and the sonnet goes like this: Come balmy sleep, tired nature's soft resort. And just pause here to raise this idea that one has always kind of associated this kind of use of language with only the male romantic poets. And here we have a woman who in 1784 is using the sonnet form to understand and capture nature in poetry pretty much the way that maybe Wordsworth, Coleridge and the others have done later.
This is interesting. I of course would agree with you, but you think that sonnet form is the male form?
More than the sonnet form being the male form, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that in this period the revival of the sonnet form is credited not to Wordsworth or Coleridge, but is credited to Charlotte Smith.
No, in the sense that it's a poem of 14 lines.
14 lines.
And there is a specific kind of meter and all those things, and that it requires that kind of skill to write a sonnet. That the sonnet will have a statement, and that statement would be a rational kind of exposition. All these things are there.
Yes, and we would generally associate all these things with men.
With the man, yes.
And also to use this as a structure, and within that structure, I think Smith is way ahead because she's already looking at nature in a way that Wordsworth is going to do much later. So, and the next line is, on these sad temples, now this is To Sleep, on these sad temples all thy poppies shed, and bid gay dreams from Morpheus's airy court float in light vision around my aching head, secure of all thy blessings partial power, on the ark bed the peasant throws him down. Now we already have the character of the peasant brought in, and in the next line there is a poor sea boy who in the rudest hour enjoys thee more than he who wears a crown. This understanding, again the French Revolution is 1789 and things have already started changing before that. So Charlotte Smith responds to those changes, I must say, by this very beautiful
mentioning
line.
those events.
Yes, and the events happen a little later, but she's already capturing the changes that lead to, I think, the finale of the revolution. And here, for instance, she's talking about the ordinary peasant, she's talking about the poor sea boy, and is placing them in contrast to the person who wears the crown, saying that they sleep much better than the man who wears the crown. So the line goes like this: and the poor sea boy in the rudest hour enjoys thee more than he who wears a crown.
So this contrast between the crown and between the poor sea boy, and she knows that they belong to two different classes.
Yes.
And one lives by labor and the other lives by privilege. And she is able to show a kind of class consciousness at that time.
At that time.
Is there something to do with Wollstonecraft here? Because she was there as a presence in the early part of the 19th century.
No, not in this case. Not in this case. Again, to compare the poor sea boy with the person who wears the crown, and then in another sonnet called The Sea View, she is very critical of war. And it seems that this sonnet was written after she actually saw two warships at a place close to Brighton. So she writes, "Move the war-freighted ships, and fierce and red flash their destructive fire. The mangled dead and dying victims then pollute the flood. Thus man spoils heaven's glorious works with blood." So
the concerns and questions that she is raising here, that draws attention.
It's a beautiful line that man spoils heaven's glorious works with blood.
Before you proceed to the other poets or the important aspects of these two poets, how do you sum it up in these two poets that you discussed in 2 or 3 sentences?
I think the two striking aspects, and one thing that's absolutely common, I think, to most women poets, is their understanding of realism is the world in which they are placed, and they are able to capture everything from domestic chores to anything, their interactions with people, and they never concentrate on just any one woman, either be it themselves or be it somebody else, but everybody from the poor sea boy or the peasant or the maid. Everybody is part of their world, and
any
they describe everybody.
That you see between the two? These two?
In this case, there is a strong distinction also, because here the mood is, Charlotte Smith concentrates more on nature, whereas Bob Wool's whole understanding stems more from describing the day-to-day, the domestic sphere, in a sense, is there in the forefront. Though Bob Wool has also written poems that deal with nature.
So which means that the broader questions of life and politics and ideology belong to Charlotte, and the questions of the day-to-day, they belong to the
Anna Letitia
Bob Wool.
So, for instance, Charlotte Smith writes other poems like "Huge Vapors Brood Over the Clifted Shore," and there is another on the departure of the nightingale, and very, very beautiful, because the nightingale is referred to as a sweet poet of the woods.
So, at this point, I would like to request Dr. Payal Nagpal to take up the discussion further with respect to other poets and the important areas that these people covered, apart from the ones that they have already been talked about. So, Dr. Payal Nagpal, please.
So, the kind of sensitivity and sensuousness that we associate with nature is something that is visible in Charlotte Smith's poetry. So, for instance, this poem on the departure of the nightingale, she calls the nightingale a sweet poet of the woods, and says a long adieu, farewell soft minstrel of the early year, and then talks about how this is a gentle bird who sings of pity best, for still thy voice shall soft affections move. And so the kind of distinction that we were talking about between Anna Bawol and Charlotte Smith is primarily on this note, that where Anna Bawol also kind of brings in nature within her poetic ambit, in this case Charlotte Smith concentrates more on nature and the kind of beauty that she sees there. So with this we move on to another poet, a very, very interesting poet called Mary Robinson, who was born in 1758.
May I interrupt you a bit?
Yes.
Because this poet talks about nightingale and describes the word nightingale, and nightingale is the main poem with Keats. So is there some similarity between the two?
I think here, yes, there is a similarity in the sense that in both cases, the nightingale her song, the voice, her belonging to the woods, and the kind of songs that she sings. I think it's all there. It's just that we've never, which is, what
we
one
never had the
feels
occasion to
that,
refer to this.
Yes. In fact, it would be great to actually read Keats's poem along with, in tandem with Charlotte Smith's On the Departure of the Nightingale.
Yes, now you might proceed to the other poet.
So a very, very interesting poet is Mary Robinson, born in 1758 and lives up to 1800. She has been described in the Dictionary of National Biography as actress, author and mistress of George, Prince of Wales, that is who later becomes George IV. And she of course worked with David Garrick of Drury Lane Theatre and made her stage debut as Juliet. She performed in many, many plays and a lot of Shakespeare plays that she did. Her portraits have been painted by famous painters like George Romney, Thomas Gainsborough and Sir Joshua Reynolds, and she led a very, very colourful life and was hugely popular. So being a stage actress, she was very, very popular. What is very important is that she too, like Charlotte Smith, she too wrote as a vocation, and money was important for her. She wrote lyrical tales, and the lyrical tales
was important or was not important?
Was important.
How? Because she's the upper class woman, and she must have been privileged.
So not really privileged in that sense, because there are many episodes to that count. But she kind of also moved on from one person to the other and so on. I had many liaisons and did not believe in any institution that would make her settle down in any way.
It's a positive thing that she wrote as a vocation.
Yes, so she wrote as a vocation, and as did Charlotte Smith. For her also writing was a vocation. In her case, of course, it was a very bad marriage, and when she separated from her husband, she started writing. In this case, it was always a vocation for her, and she wrote what is called lyrical tales, and these are similar to Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads. She wrote under many pseudonyms and wrote for many magazines. She also wrote for the Morning Post, and it seems, as again Abrams and Stillinger point out, that she succeeded Robert Southey as poetry editor. So a very, very accomplished poet that we have in Mary Robinson. She wrote in blank verse, and there were poems that she also wrote in rhyme, but there is a strong musical tone that was prominent. So there is a poem that she had written, The Haunted Beach, and Coleridge said of her, "The meter, aye, that woman has an ear." And so she also returned this similar compliment by writing a poem called To the Poet Coleridge. This was after she read Kubla Khan. But
she was moving in high circles, and
yes. So, but again, a very, very important poem. I think a must read if we have to understand Romanticism, if we have to understand the realist movement at the time, is London's Summer Morning, written in 1804. And she writes, "Who has not waked to list the busy sounds of summer's morning in the sultry smoke of noisy London?" Summer morning, sultry smoke, noisy London. I think in just this line itself, she's described what England was like at the time. On the pavement, hot the sooty chimney boy with dingy face and tattered covering. If I go on to other sounds are very, very important, which is why that even when there are poems that are not in rhyme, the whole musical tonality is there in her poetry. So, rousing the sleepy maid, there is a milk pail that rattles, there is a tinkling bell, there is a dustman's office, while the street is lost in clouds impervious. There is a din of hackney coaches, wagons, carts, tin men's shops, noisy trunk makers, knife grinders, coopers, squeaking cock cutters.
That's remarkable, I must say.
It is a must read.
Entire London of that time is evoked here.
In just this one poem.
And that London which is not available to us.
Yes. And it goes on. It doesn't end here. So we have, for instance, knife grinders, coopers, squeaking cock cutters, fruit sparrows, hunger giving cries. All this is set against hunger giving cries.
It's a social landscape of the city.
It is a social landscape of the city. There are vegetable vendors, there are shops that display their trade, fresh sprinkled pavement that cools the feet of early walkers. There is a ruddy housemaid. I'm not reading the complete, but just picking up the characters and sounds and pictures that are captured here. Then there is a bandbox, darts burning splendor on the glittering pane. So everything from, you know, the early morning light to the noisy London, shops where beauty smiles with industry, a smart damsel, pastry dainties catch the eye, humming insects, tall ladders. It goes on.
This is 18th century London.
Yes.
I think after Dr. Johnson, this is what comes to mind.
Yes. So, and the poor poet wakes from busy dreams to paint the summer morning. So the range of characters and, you know, the kind of industrialization
and
that
she
we
has
talk
that kind
about.
of roving eye, you know,
Yes.
of a different kind.
Of a different
She
kind.
goes to all the details of London life
Yes.
at that time.
And the people she's describing, they're the ordinary people.
Ordinary people.
They are people who work with their hands. They are people who work to kind of earn a living. And she's described all of them. They're part of the city landscape. And it's really, really a wonderful poem to read. There is another poem that she writes. It's called January 1795, and the poem was written somewhere around 1806. And she describes the time as pavement slippery, people sneezing, lords in ermine, beggars freezing, titled gluttons.
Oh, I see.
Very, very
There's
hard.
social antagonism also shown very clearly.
Very clearly. The next line is titled gluttons, dainties carving, genius in a garret starving.
Title glutton is absolutely remarkable.
Yes.
In that sense.
I just repeat these 4 lines.
See the contempt that she has
That
for
she has.
for this person.
Absolutely wonderful poet. So she writes, pavement slippery, people sneezing, lords in ermine, beggars freezing, titled gluttons, dainties carving, genius in a garret starving.
And see the rhythm with which you
rhythm is
are
there. Yes.
reciting it.
In fact, each stanza is absolutely rhythmic, and it brings in all the antagonisms of its time. So for instance, there are lofty mansions and courtiers who are voracious, and misers who scratch the wretched heeding. There are gallant soldiers who fight and are bleeding. And
It's a kind of Ben Jonson here, you know, people with humors, people with gluttony and all those things.
Yes.
They are being shown here in a different setting, in a different social setting there. Yes.
so another very interesting stanza here is, arts and sciences bewailing, commerce drooping, credit falling, placemen mocking subjects loyal, separation, weddings royal. So
Which means there is a kind of clash that is happening at the level of the privileged and the traders. So trade is slowing down, and those people are really enjoying themselves.
yes, and the royalty in that sense
Yes,
is having these lavish weddings and so on. And authors who can't earn a dinner, many a subtle rogue a winner. So only those who know how to kind of toe the line are the ones who will be the winners.
Yes, yes.
And nobody is spared here. So for instance, ladies gambling night and morning, fools the work of genius scorning. And
she has seen all this, from close quarters, and she is picking these details up in order to share her disgust with the readers.
yes. So if we look at it, her poetry, Mary Robinson's poetry, describes things at various levels. One, in terms of the objective reality, or who are the people who make London what it is, and at the same time the kind of absolute gaping gulf that is there between the rich and the poor.
The noisy London is of the workers, and this kind of dainty England and London is for the privileged.
Is for the privileged.
Yes.
So poets, painters, musicians, lawyers, doctors, politicians, they seek fame by different roads, and gallant souls remain with empty purses. So
Yes, yes.
again, there is another interesting one which of course can be read.
I think the period is romantic, and the concerns are romantic and something more.
Yes.
The romantic in a different sense, that those who are poor, that they have a kind of consciousness that is typical, and that so where the other person that people are concerned, they are criticized.
Yes.
So criticism is, I think, 18th century, and the emphasis that she's placing on the poor people, that takes her towards romanticism.
And there is an objective tone. In fact, that's what I noticed in all the women writers. Even when they're talking about nature, there is an objective tone, and there is this whole idea of what it really means to the ordinary people. I think that concern remains with them.
This is the crux of romanticism in some cases. Keats would talk about it sometimes. Yes.
There's another very interesting poem by Robinson again called Female Fashions for 1799, and she goes into great details. I guess we won't have the time for this, but for instance, a pair of shoulders, strong, and so everything about what is worn and which country it comes from. Is it from Russia? Is it from Paris? So she, as you pointed out, that she has access to all this, and so she also captures this in her poetry. And with this, we come to another poet, and of course, a lot of people must have heard the name Dorothy Wordsworth. So
she wrote poetry.
Yes, and she also had her own entries in the journals that she wrote. But she also wrote poetry, and Grammaire fragment is interesting because she describes a cottage, and again, though there is a slight change by the time we reach Dorothy Wordsworth, I think it's the concerns shift slightly, because we are looking at a poet who now kind of is born towards the latter part of the 18th century and is writing in the third or fourth decades of the 19th century. So the early poets, in a sense, I think are done with Mary Robinson. And here there is this idea of, I think, nature and the kind of solitude and solace that nature provides. I think she concentrates on that. And again, like Barbol talks about the domestic sphere and how that figures in, I think Dorothy Wordsworth sticks to the whole idea of nature, and that is what determines the course of her poetry. So, for instance, Grammaire fragment: peaceful our valley, fair and green, and beautiful her cottages, each in its nook, its sheltered hold, or underneath its tuft of trees. Yet when I sit on rock or hill, down looking on the valley fair, the cottage with its clustering trees summons my heart. It settles there. So what we have here is a poet who is looking at this cottage, and she describes the cottage in great detail, and the cottage, in a sense, sums up whatever nature means to her, and how she relates to it. So, for instance, the house, she calls it the very mountain's child, and the trees that shelter it from the storm, the presence of tall pine trees, and she says, a stranger, Grammaire, in thy valley, all faces then to me unknown. I left my sole companion friend to wander out alone. This whole idea that as a woman, she doesn't need anybody, but the cottage draws her, and she just decides to wander out alone.
She was a close companion of Wordsworth, her brother,
yes,
and of Coleridge, the friend of the family. And I think she shares some imaginative concerns with them, particularly Wordsworth.
Completely. I think the way, in fact, which is why I said that the tone shifts, because her concerns are more Wordsworthian in that sense, that she looks at nature again in terms of the kind of solace that it provides to her, and how her thoughts kind of run a particular course
as a kind of calming influence,
and how like Wordsworth, she too looks at the ordinary, though of course the kind of imagination that Coleridge uses in his poetry is not something that we can see here, but I think she is able to kind of create her own by talking about nature in a way that it appeals to her.
So once again, a bird of or an individual of the Lake Districts, nothing much to do with London.
Yes.
And she has her companions as the hills, as the cottages, and the nature that appears before her, and she identifies with it.
Yes.
So is there a kind of mystery that one sees in her regarding nature?
I'm
just asking questions.
I somehow don't see it as mystery. In fact, I see it as something that's well explained.
I see.
So that idea of mystery is only there in the fact that how is it that one particular aspect of nature appeals to her, but then that is why it belongs to her as an individual, as a poet, as a woman.
So she enjoys the company of nature, but she doesn't raise questions regarding mystery, which is Wordsworth.
Not in the way that Wordsworth
does.
Not in that way.
Wordsworth would be able to see nature, as so far deeply interfused in all those lines. She would not go there, but she would identify certain natural objects as houses, as hills and hilltops and all those things.
So here, for instance, she's focused entirely on the cottage, and so she says, "My youthful wishes all fulfilled, wishes matured by thoughtful choice. I stood an inmate of this valley. How could I but rejoice?" So there is great joy there. And the joy stems from this understanding of nature.
Would you call her a child of nature?
Yes.
She's talking as if so fondly she's talking about nature here.
Yes.
And she has been mostly lonely or in the company of her brother. And there aren't many other people that she would meet.
Yes, and despite that, she says that she decided to wander out alone. And that's what makes it very specific as as this poem belongs to her in that sense.
I'm just guessing. Would it be that her tone is very intimate and soft?
Yes, her tone is intimate. Her tone is soft, and again, it's not as if she's kind of just thinking aloud. She's able to kind of make the meaning reach the reader. And that I think is a very important aspect.
Now I get it. Which means that she would not wonder as Wordsworth sometimes would wonder. She would try to explain what she saw.
Yes, which is why it's different in that sense from the Wordsworthian tone.
So even though she is Wordsworth's sister, she has her own identity, and that identity is of nature and her together. And she doesn't feel like philosophizing about nature.
Yes.
She would like to describe it.
She describes it. She describes it and also describes it in terms of what it means to her and how these are simple images. I think simplicity is what she captures in nature, and that gives her great joy. And for instance, there's another poem called The Mother's Return, in which there are these children, especially there's a little boy who's waiting for the mother to return, and the mother is to return the next day. And so how they spend their time and how the children are put to sleep. So there is a complete description of that day.
This idea of the mother in this role wouldn't be there in Wordsworth. He talks of himself as an individual and the nature around, and thinks of his own growth and maturity. There's a word maturity that you mentioned in her case also.
Yes.
But that maturity is only of the vision.
Yes. For instance, this particular poem, The Mother's Return, it ends very interestingly. 5 minutes passed, and oh the change. Asleep upon their beds they lie, their busy limbs in perfect rest, and close the sparkling eye.
Oh.
So you know how the child's eye dreams. I think in one word she's captured that.
She is able to derive pleasure from the sight of children, unlike other romantic poets.
Yes.
There is a hidden kind of domesticity here, that children are being put to sleep, and they are happy and they are shining and all those things. Yes, I think that makes her a woman romantic poet.
Yes, and in fact there is that sense of maturity when we begin from Anna Bobol and we reach Dorothy Wordsworth. I think there is a kind of maturity and evolution and a connecting thread. So there is another very interesting title to one of her poems called The Floating Island, and she talks about the floating island, and it's her imagination. She says that might see it from the mossy shore, dissevered float upon the lake, float with its crest of trees adorn, on which the wobbling birds their pastime take. So she talks about the ripe berries, insects who live their lives and die. A peopled world it is, in size a tiny room. How the island is, and then she says that you never know. Someday you might come and that island might not be there. So I think
it's a floating island,
and it's a floating island. So she says that she ends it like this: buried beneath the glittering lake, its place no longer to be found. Yet the lost fragments shall remain to fertilize some other ground. I think the cycle of life, the whole process of life, I think she's captured that.
So she's seeing humanity also as a part of nature.
Yes.
They will grow, they will die, then some remnant will remain, and once that will regenerate itself. Yes. This is a different idea.
So, and with these ideas, and the tone is of course very different from Mary Robinson, who's going into absolute
The
objective
nitty-gritty of the family.
Yes.
That's not here.
or the nitty-gritty of the people who are there in London. I think
that's
she's
not
doing
there.
that. That's not there in this case. So I think looking at these poets together, we can see that I think any understanding of romanticism would be incomplete without the contribution of the English women romantic poets to this particular trend. And they are able to, in a sense, give some kind of direction, actually, which makes it kind of crystallize as a proper movement, I think, in the hands of the mainstream poets, who of course I say it crystallizes there because they have access to resources, the time to kind of look at it in terms of a vocation, whereas the women don't.
And they are making good use of the resources.
They are making good use of the resources.
They are not whiling away, wasting away, and all those things, as was the case with some people in London, which were captured by the other poets.
Yes.
So they use their time well.
They use their time well. But of course, I mean, having looked at these 4 poets, I think Mary Robinson particularly stands out with her descriptions of London. I think that is a very, very striking poem that we have.
Which means, so far as Mary Robinson is concerned, you see a different level of awareness, or social awareness of the questions that people face in their lives, and that makes her stand apart from the other poets. Would you say that?
I would say that because if she has access to a certain way of life, then she is making very good use of it.
So she is talking about society and its different ladders, and one has to be, giving this kind of merit to her, because her vision is larger, bigger. She goes beyond nature. She goes to society. She looks at it very closely, and then gives her own ideas. So a combination of ideas, feelings, experience, and a greater range of vision is the hallmark of that romantic poet.
Yes.
How do you conclude the concluding remarks, for a minute or so regarding these poets? If
I think we have to understand that any kind of romantic trend has to be looked at from all perspectives.
Which means that a kind of general view of romanticism can be derived from these poets who offer only aspects of life at that time, but if you put them together, then you realize that a kind of vision emerges.
Yes.
So there are women who are putting their labor together, and they are coming to a conclusion. I think thank you very much for this kind of discussion about the romantic poets and romantic poetry in the hands of women. And I believe that this is a topic that has not been covered by most critics in English literature, and this should open doors for the Indian viewer and the Indian reader to romanticism of a different kind. Well, quality wise, it's a part of the larger romanticism, but when you come to closely watch the developments in romantic poetry of the 19th century and late the 18th century, you realize that well, there were women, they were aware, they were conscious, and they had their own independence of outlook at that point of time. So, thanks Dr. Payal Nagpal and viewers. I hope you have enjoyed this very distinctive lecture by Dr. Payal Nagpal. Thank you.